Hello everyone, my name is Marcin, or in music my nickname Alpa. I will have the occasion to run this panel, to moderate, and we will talk about hard, soft and al dente science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction in general. We have 4 panelists with us, so we have Christy Golden, Brian McClellan, Ben Kane, and Angus Watson. So, first of all, thank you very much for coming. And what I tend to do on each panel I'm moderating is to firstly, let's say, set the borders of what we'll be talking about and to have the common understanding of the topic. So, if you can start to tell me or tell us what are the boundaries between soft and hard science fiction or soft and hard fantasy, soft and hard magic for you, how you would be understanding it and how you would be referring to it today. So, Christy, if we can start with you.
Hello. There we are. Oh, hi. The actual terms that I started when I started writing about 30 years ago was told when I was discussing with my agent were hard science fiction, and social science fiction. And the general consensus was that hard science fiction was very much focused on technology, plot, science, very heavily on that, whereas social science fiction really had a story that was set about people that was set against the background. So that was kind of the distinction that I began working with. And I tend to lean more on the social science, rather than hard science, personally in my work.
Yeah, I was always told that like the hard science fiction, you had to have a PhD to be able to understand. And the person that wrote it probably has several PhDs. So I've never really read that kind of stuff. So when it comes to fantasy, though, which is what I actually write, you kind of have a spectrum. This is going to be the 3rd panel I've mentioned Brandon Sanderson on. Brandon is almost the gold standard in terms of hard magic because he has built most of his career on this idea of creating really intricate magic systems that are very, very well defined. You know exactly what they can do, and you know what boundaries there are, and he's always keeping the characters inside those boundaries, but trying to let them, twist the magic and work within his rules to do really interesting things. And then you've got kind of the far side of that is going to be like Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, because you don't know what he's capable of. You don't really see a lot of his magic. You get references that he's very powerful, and he does some very cool things, but it's very vague, and you're never sure whether Gandalf is actually going to save the day, or whether he's gonna wink and nod and get someone else to save the day. And so that's kind of the 2 opposite ends of the spectrum for me.
So can you phrase it for historical fiction? Because I have an opinion on them, but I don't write them. So are you talking about light historical fiction, or heavy, or?
Yeah, hard science fiction and soft science fiction, also hard and soft fantasy or magic. So I can see a place myself for historical fiction there, but
okay.
That's how you understand it for now.
Yeah, okay, so history light or history heavy. Getting a sense of place in an historical novel is the most important thing you can do, because if you start reading a book that's set 100 years ago or 2,000 years ago, like I write a lot of Roman stuff, and you don't get a sense of place, then you might as well be sitting in Perkon in 2019 talking about a guy with a sword, and it doesn't feel any different. So it's not just sense of location, which is vital, but it's also dialogue is vital. Do you use, you've got to be careful with how modern your dialogue seems, And I've had many emails over the years, my Amazon reviews, negative Amazon reviews. So many authors say to me, I don't read my Amazon reviews, and I just look at them and go, you're a liar. I read my Amazon reviews, not as much as I used to, but bad Amazon reviews often have a good nugget of truth in there, as painful as it is to take. But one of the ones I've regularly had, more, not so much now, but was that my dialogue was too modern. And my answer to that is, do you want me to write my book in ancient Latin? Plus I can't, because we don't know how the Romans spoke. So in my opinion, as long as you feel drawn into ancient Rome, in my case, then that's as good a job as you can do, because it's impossible to be totally accurate about it. So sense of place and location and characters that you can believe in, with a lot of research as well, that's what I try to do. I wouldn't call it heavy history, but it's definitely not light history.
Great. I don't really have anything to add that's relevant, so I want to add to the modern language things. That's one of the accusations I get with my writing. And I always say that one of my problems with people looking at history is that they think people 2,000 years ago were a great big lump of humanity that walked around going, oh, I don't know. Yeah, I'll follow that king, won't follow that king, or I am a hero, and that was all there was to them. They weren't. Their brains were actually slightly larger than ours, and they were just as complicated and weird as every single one of you. And the only way I think you can reflect that is by using modern language, because they would have spoken like us. I mean, I had an email saying, a guy describes a woman as hot. I hardly think that would have happened in the Iron Age. I absolutely think it would have done. There would have been idiot men who had temperature-based descriptions of women. And in the same way, they wouldn't have used the word chair, but you don't mind me using that word. So at that point, I also think I write historical fantasy, so I'll give you an example of hard historical is Patrick O'Brien's books, which very much, the Master and Commander series, which show you exactly what life was like aboard a ship about 200 years ago. And on the opposite end of the scale, you get things like my fantasy books, which are full of history, but are really about the characters and the fun and the plot, rather than trying to tell you exactly what was happening at the time.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I need to say that I'm sorry because I totally forgot about one important thing before the first question, and I didn't give you the time to introduce yourself. And I can see that most of the room already know you, but just in case someone don't, if you can say just 1 or 2 words about yourself, it will be appreciated. So maybe we can now start with you, Angus.
Well, during the last panel, I was congratulating myself for not mentioning my books for 3 panels in a row, and I just did it. So I write historical fantasy. The first trilogy, Age of Iron, is based in Iron Age Britain and has the Romans coming across, and the second trilogy is Vikings in North America, with big fantastical elements. And the first book of that is available in Poland.
Thank you, Angus. I'm Ben Kane, Irishman, live in England. My 13th novel is coming out in English next week, 11 of them in Polish, only about 6 so far, all of them Roman, generally set in the Republic, although one trilogy is in the early Empire. Basically, think all the bloody battles you can ever see in a fantasy book, only real history, with huge amounts of blood and death. Based on research as much as I can, and I also dress as a Roman, and I've walked Hadrian's Wall in full Roman gear, including the shoes, and I'm about to do it again in a month. I don't know why.
I'm Brian McClellan. I write the Powder Mage books, which are kind of flintlock epic fantasy about mages who snort gunpowder to get magical powers.
How do you follow that? My name is Christy Golden, and I've written 6 original novels, fantasy novels, but I've also done, which most of you know me from, a lot of media tie-in works, and actually my 54th book came out last year, which is, I'm like, how did that happen? But because I have done so many varied things, I've had to learn a little bit about a lot of things, and so I'm always learning and always up for the next adventure.
Okay. Thank you very much. So now we can go to our topic. I do believe that we'll be mostly talking about fantasy, as all of you have written more or less closer to the fantasy, while science fiction, I know that, Christy, you have some novels set in science fictional worlds, but as far as I checked, you have not written science fiction at all. Yep. So we will stick mainly to fantasy. Yeah, Christy, I know. But still, if you will have any opinions also on the science fiction, feel free to add it. It will be very welcomed. So the first one is, which of the approaches is easier for you? Do you prefer to describe how the world works, how it is set, and how the magic works there, as you mentioned, that Brandon tends to do, or you prefer the Tolkienish way, so the magic is there and just accept it? And maybe Brian, you can start because you mentioned Brandon before, so maybe.
So I was actually a student of Brandon's back before he was Brandon Sanderson. When his first book Elantris came out, I was actually in this class at this university that he was teaching a single creative writing course in, so that had a deep effect on me, obviously. But so I tend to be towards that side. But Brandon has actually teased me about this because I also tend to abide by the rule of cool, which is I will totally break my own rules if it seems like it's going to be worth it. If the audience is going to not notice because they're too busy going, oh yeah, that was cool, then I'll do that. I try not to do it as much anymore. My first book, Promise of Blood, I do it quite a lot, and it. Looking back at it as a more mature writer, I kind of cringe at it a little because I talk a lot about internal consistency, and internal consistency does not necessarily allow for the rule of cool, because you want everything to make sense and you want it to all fit together and not break those rules. So I try not to anymore. But there's still times when, I have a character who I want them to just be amazing in this scene, and there's something amazing they can do, and so I'll stretch my own rules a little bit. And it's fun. They're epic fantasy novels, and I don't pretend to be writing high literature. I definitely just write kind of pop, fun, novels that are I want them to be enjoyable foremost, and. If a pedantic person comes up and lectures me about my books, I can say, I'm a fantasy novelist. I can do what I want.
Of course, I guess the question for me would be like, which project? Because generally when you're working with media books, you already have everything that you need to do. The world is already pretty well established, and you kind of go from there. I have, however, written 3 books in a 5-book series. About 10 years ago that came out, and it's based on the elements, and so each of the books focuses on one of the elements, and a character who sometimes they know this and sometimes they don't, is that element embodied. And the world is very mythic in that it's been created, and there's a final battle between good and evil, and twice the world has won, twice good has won, twice evil has won, and this is the final dance. They call it the dances, and this is the 5th one. So, the big tiebreaker. So against that, what I wanted to do was to have each of the books focus on one of the particular characters. So I would start doing cultural research because I would let the climate dictate it. For instance, my fire character, I did a lot of research on desert climates, and from a variety of cultures, and I found that there were a lot of things that were very similar, and so that I let dictate it, and that of course is hard scientific research as to what happens in a desert and things like that. And from that I developed a culture that would realistically thrive in that drew from many different cultures, but was not, couldn't point to that and go, oh, that's ancient Egypt. There were certain aspects of that, but there were also like from Native American tribes that were desert dwelling. So I kind of for that's what I did, is I started to look at the natural world and what kind of a culture and a civilization would grow from that.
Okay, so I write historical fiction, as I mentioned already. So what I'm going to talk about is not fantasy, but it's the research, and go back a bit to context and sense of place. There's an expression in English when you're writing historical fiction called an info dump, and that's where everything about your world, and you want the reader to know everything immediately, and you're so happy that all this knowledge that I see lots of heads nodding here, because you're writers or you've seen it in books. You'll see it in my first couple of books really badly. I desperately want you, the reader, to know that I know everything about Roman soldiers of this period. I'm going to tell you it all in one paragraph. And I look at it now. Well, I don't look at it now, but if I picked up my first book, apologies if you're reading it for the info dumps, the hilarious thing is now, I will write, I'm on, you know, well, more than 10 books, and I put in less historical detail than I ever did, but commonly the Amazon reviews that I don't read, that I do read, people will say, you can really feel ancient Rome in this book, and I'm going, how does that work? And it goes back to a wonderful quote by, there's an amazing author who's now dead called Rosemary Sutcliffe, and she wrote a fantastic children's book, which it's good for adults too, called The Eagle of the Ninth, about a Roman legion in England. And her books, she wrote many, many books, and they just have this rich feeling of place, whether it was ancient Greece or Arthurian Britain or Roman Britain. And she used to say that the writer does all this research, you know, maybe months or years of research, and their information in the finished book needs to be like an iceberg. 10% showing on the surface with 90% underneath. So all those wonderful things that you read about, you think, oh, I must put that in the book. It feeds your writer's sense of place or whatever, or your writer's awareness. So, but sometimes they're too good. You know, the things that you read are too good to walk away from. So I read about a guy in 12th century France. I'm writing a book about Richard the Lionheart now, and I read about a guy who displeased the king, a noble. So he had slept with this king's wife, and the king wasn't very happy when he found out. So he had this noble hung upside down in a sewer until he drowned. I thought, I'm going to put that in my book because I wouldn't have ever thought of that. So yeah, I don't know whether that feeds the conversation. Hopefully it does. Over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think 10% would be way too much historical detail to put in. It's terrifying how much you should take out and how much you shouldn't include, especially when you've done so much research and you're desperate to prove it. So my latest novel's on Native Americans. I have my characters walking through a city at the beginning, and the first draft has about 2 pages of what they walked past. You know, and as they describe, sort of 9 different types of sport they might be playing and what the materials of everything was built out of. First edit, that was knocked down to they walked past 2 kids playing with a hoop and ball. Third edit, that was knocked down to the character was talking, he had to stop talking because the hoop whacked into his leg. And I think that's an important point. Your detail should be part of the action as much as possible. If you're trying to knock in some historical detail. On the magic front, whether to describe the magic or not, so I also have magic in my books. In Nicholas Eames' Kings of the Wild, or is it Kings of the Weird? Which I don't know if it's out in Poland yet. It will be, it's very popular. Anyway, he hardly describes the magic at all, and that works very well, so I don't think you have to. But I think just like building character and building the story, it's all about suspense and almost telling the reader and then bringing it back. Then almost telling the reader and bringing it back. So in my latest trilogy, you don't find out how the magic works until pretty much the last chapter. So I think that's a nice thing to do throughout the book, is to hold it back, and I think it works as a reader to have that suspense.
It's funny because I'm working on I was talking about this in my Q&A if anybody was there, my next universe. And so I'm designing the world and the magic and everything. And that's what I did with the magic, was that I held back. And the first comment I got from my agent was, don't hold back. This is what the fans are there for. Because your fans want to see dynamic magic and they want to see it right away. And so show it quickly.
But sure, do they want to know how it works right away? Can you hold that back to tease them?
She wanted me to, she wanted me to kind of bleed through, but she wanted the magic to be featured very quickly.
You know, I get that, but the actual explanation of how it works, I think, can be held.
And yeah, and I think that is true, yeah.
Because in Brandon Sanderson, I think it's his first book where he has a guy in the first chapter running along a corridor and suddenly he's running on the roof. And you go, Christ, how is this happening? I want to know. And you don't discover how it's happening until a lot later. In fact, later after I stopped reading, I think.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think that the next question will be related to pitfalls and what you find the most difficult, or what are the pitfalls you can see in both approaches, so in using the hard and soft approach to writing. And maybe Ben, this time maybe you can start.
Pitfalls in hard and soft. Ah, my goodness. Pitfalls in general. I usually find out about pitfalls after I've fallen into them. I kind of in life as well. One of my oldest friends says to me, Ben, most of us can see potential problems and avoid them. You just hit them head on and then deal with them. My first marriage. Yep. So I'm much better at predicting them now. So, but with my first trilogy, can we go back 4 questions, because it did have a bit of magic in it. It had a soothsayer who could read the future. But my first trilogy, what I didn't do well enough at all was to anticipate plot lines that might lead somewhere else in future. In other words, where you can seed them off into other books in the future. I just closed off loads of avenues. And I know I met a guy who wrote a TV series that was quite successful in the UK called Plebs. It's about Romans. And he only thought one TV series, where I see some heads nodding, he thought only one TV series would happen, because that's what most TV series don't get renewed. And so he closed off most of his plot lines, and then they recommissioned it. So I've learned to leave things open, and I've also learned to sometimes leave story strands unanswered just because I can. And that gets emails coming in. What happened to that guy? I don't know. Why don't you write a book about him? Okay, if you crowdfund it. So it's got nothing to do with hard and soft. I'm sorry, but yeah. Next person.
Angus, you go next.
I don't have an answer ready. Okay, I'll just say something. Okay, so I mean, one pitfall, I think my first book also has too much exposition. It's like a confessional. And one way to deal with this is one way I've noticed in reading a lot of books recently, if you absolutely have to do an info dump, do it after something massive happens. So in a book like Gone Girl, for example, which has a huge reveal in the middle, next chapter is info dumping, and I think that's a good way to do it. So there's a pitfall and how to avoid it. Over to you.
Yeah, I talked about my big pitfall a little bit already, in that in my first book, I broke some of my own established rules. And the reason that is a pitfall at the end of the day is because then, especially because it's the first book in a trilogy, is because then readers have the expectation that those things are now fair game. They can now be used by any of the characters because, yeah, you made it part of the world. You made it part of the magic. And if I want those to be one-off things, kind of, single-use fantastic things, I have to give a good explanation why those are one-off things. And I didn't really do that. And so, I got an occasional email saying, in subsequent books, why didn't a character do something similar to what they had done in that first book? And, the answer is basically, because I realized that was kind of a mistake, and I decided to tighten up the system, and so that's just an author thing, and that kind of breaks narrative, and gets people to kind of come out and scratch their heads rather than keep reading, and so which is why I try to tighten everything up more nowadays.
I hadn't thought about this because my head wasn't in it. My head has been in Azeroth for most of this convention. And there was a book that I actually wrote under a pen name about 20 years ago called AD 999. And it takes place in, guess when? Guess when? AD 999, crazy, right? But it takes place in England. And the basic premise is that Satan has discovered a loophole to bring about a premature judgment day, and he enlists the help of Loki to carry it out. And the two people standing against him are a crippled monk and a pagan witch wife. And hijinks ensue. But for me, I think it was super ambitious because I had to research so many things just for one book, because it kind of has an ending, right? You know, this isn't something that you can make a series out of. And so I was really trying to juggle, attempting to write historical fiction for the first time. So I had to research the book of Revelations deeply, because I wanted to have all of the signs enacted right up to the very final one. I had to research life in a monastery. I had to research doomsday prophecies of the time. I had to research Norse mythology. I had to research pagan activities of the time. So it was an awful, awful lot. And at that time, you had to have a certain, there was a price break in the books. So you could do up to a certain number of pages, and then if you went beyond that, you had to raise the price of the book, and they didn't want to do that. So it was 500 pages, and I came in all the way to the bottom of that 500 page. But I think the pitfall for me was perhaps being a tad ambitious, biting off more than I could chew. But I am very proud to report that that book actually won an award. So sometimes when you're ambitious and crazy, the dice roll is in your favor.
I just wanted to add that perhaps a modern pitfall is causing offence. We were discussing earlier, Ben, was it you who had two characters with red hair in your book who were both baddies, and you got letters or emails because you can't have two characters with red hair who are baddies. A common one is for your baddies to have facial disfigurements, to have scars. People with facial disfigurements don't like this, it turns out. And I've actually done some work with a charity called Changing Faces, and once you meet these guys, you suddenly go, crap, you know, I actually must not do this. So that's something else to bear in mind, particularly in the modern world where you'll find out if you've caused offence more quickly than perhaps you used to. There are more mediums, so more media, which to find it out.
Yeah, just on that, I've had that with not a huge amount, and it's usually been negative reviews rather than people contacting me. Because it was normal in Roman times for women, as they were women, you were a woman by 13. When you died at 30, 35, women got married at 13. And so I have that in my books, and it's correct. And I've been accused of verging on pedophilia because I'm putting children who are being forced to have sex being married. I'm going, no, that is the history. So with that one, I refuse completely to change it, because it's otherwise I'm writing false history. It's like, I'm sorry, it's really distasteful to us now. Obviously, I don't like it, but it's accurate. So.
It's a tricky one, though, because you're writing for a modern audience, and you don't offend them. I mean, I think that particular case, you're right, but I think there are certain things that went on in the past that perhaps you should leave alone.
Totally. So a friend of mine who writes Roman fiction would say you can't portray a Roman man accurately because he was racist, misogynistic, anti-gay. He thought everyone who wasn't a Roman was subhuman.
Like an 80s Brit.
But so he said, you have to make that character appealing, and he's right. But at the same time, I don't believe we should sugarcoat it for historical fiction. Otherwise, what's the point? You might as well just go, everything was lovely back then, and everyone was nice.
Yeah. And half the emperors were women, and
yeah. You know, it's unpleasant, but at the same time, you do soften the character by not making him totally misogynistic and racist and homophobic, because otherwise you, the reader, doesn't like him.
Okay, so the next question, we'll move a little bit from you as the authors to you as the readers. So, Christy, maybe we can start with you. Do you prefer to read the fiction that is rather hard or rather soft when it comes to the way how the work works?
For historical fiction, or just
in general, in the genre, yeah.
I am very, very character driven. That's where my interest lies. I'm also dabbled in theater, so diving deep into a character is something that I enjoy doing and I enjoy reading about. But I'm also a big fan of history, so I really enjoy diving deeper into something perhaps that I already know a considerable amount about, but also being introduced to something that I'm not familiar with by somebody who knows what they're doing and manages to marry them. So I would say, I'm going to be evasive and say a blend of it, because I think both are important. It's great to have a character-driven story, but it also should be a story that can only be told through that particular the area of the world, of the history, or that particular style of fantasy or science fiction. There should be a reason that the author chose to do it as, say, historical fiction rather than historical fantasy, or as science fiction.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same place where it's not about, you know, kind of the hard or soft magic or anything like that. It's really about, you know, give me interesting characters, give me something cool happening, something interesting that I can follow along in the narrative. And then if you have, like, you know, Brandon Sanderson style magic that's very dynamic and very involved and almost like anime-like, that you can picture it really easily, then that's great. But it's kind of like a set piece. It's part of the background rather than, you know, a conflict that's moving forward and being interesting. And so I tend to like the harder magic, but it's because the authors that I read that do it are writing compelling stories. When it comes to science fiction, I mean, I don't think I've ever read real hard sci-fi, because you kind of start some of these and you go, all right, well, this person just spent 3 pages explaining to me how a hyperdrive works. Nothing's happened. I'm very bored. I don't understand any of it. So I guess I'm not going to keep reading. And that's kind of, I don't know if hard sci-fi in that way even really exists anymore. I'm sure it does. I'm sure there's, you know, writers that do it, but I can't think of an example off the top of my head, just because it's, you know, it's so focused on the minutia rather than the story, and story seems to kind of be king these days.
This is why I don't read sci-fi anymore. So I used to read sci-fi and fantasy a lot when I was a kid, Isaac Asimov and Heinlein and stuff. And when you get to the 3rd page of the hyperdrive, we call it a wall banger in English, where you throw it against the wall, it's gone. It's got to be about character. So place and context is everything, but it's got to be about character. The story is all important, whether it's fantasy or sci-fi or historical fiction. And I just like to tell you about a book. One of the things that I was quite upset by, I probably all heard of Bernard Cornwell. He's a very famous British historical fiction author, like 50 books, 50 countries. And I was at a talk he gave a few years ago, and someone asked him, did he still read a lot of historical fiction? And he said, I don't read any historical fiction anymore. I just read thrillers. And the moderator said, why? And he said, because I find it boring. And I looked at him and I thought, no, please no, because I love historical fiction. I'm jealous of all of you as readers, because I can feel that happening to me. It's got to be an exceptional historical fiction book for me to be taken in, and one that I read last year. I really hope it is translated into Polish, and if it isn't, if you read in English, I thoroughly recommend you read it, because it's magic too. It's called Lancelot. And it's by a friend of mine called Giles Christian, and it's the story of Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot. Only this brilliant idea he had, it was Lancelot that Guinevere fell in love with first. So Arthur was the one who came into the triangle, not Lancelot. And I read that book. I got sent it for a quote, and I dutifully read it. We all do this. We dutifully read them. And I started crying at some of the descriptions. And when I read the final chapter, I read it 6 times in a row. I just went back to the beginning of the final chapter, and I've never done that with a book. And I was crying and crying and crying because it was so amazing. And I put down the phone, or put down the book, and I just rang Giles. And I said, this book is, I don't use the obscenity, brilliant. It is absolutely fantastic. And it's got magic, but it's also got historical context, and it's totally character driven. It's just an amazing book.
I'm gonna follow up on something you said there, because I have found that I don't read as much anymore, and I also find that I don't read in my field as much anymore. Not because it's boring, but because my critical brain gets turned on. because it's something that I understand and that I can find plot holes with, and it feels like, well, I'm working now, you know, I'm settling down on my job to read this. So I actually read police procedurals. Which I don't have to worry about because I don't know that, and it's always fresh and entertaining to me. But yeah, it really is wonderful when you find something in your field that makes you feel like revived. You're experiencing the magic all over again, and that becomes increasingly rare, I think. The more you do something, the more you know about it.
Like the rest of the panel, I don't like it too hard. But I do understand that some people do. My brother, like Ben here, is a veterinarian, although he's still a veterinarian. He stayed on, you know, mending animals. And he's got a very scientific mind. He doesn't think that I'm funny at all, and has never laughed at one of my jokes ever.
Well, nobody else does either.
Yeah, fair enough.
Sorry.
But you're hilarious. And he likes deeply detailed. He'd be wanting to read page 4 of your hyperdrive description. So I think there is a place for it. And I love the writing of Patrick O'Brien, as I mentioned, who wrote the Master and Commander series, even though it's quite detailed technical stuff about British sailing boats, which pretty much goes over my head, even though I can't, you know, I've done a lot of sailing. So I think there's definitely a place for hard description for an audience, and if you want to write it, write it.
As we are approaching to the end of the panel, I wanted to ask if we have any questions from the audience. If not, I can go with a few more, but if there are any questions from the audience, it's a good time to ask them now. Please raise your hand if you have. Yeah, so I will run. No.
Yeah, I have a question, but I think that is it working? I have a question. The thing is that we could apply to both fantasy and sci-fi. How is your approach to, you know, put some realism into the non-human creatures and races, especially in their cultures? Because I think it's somewhat cheap to, you know, lifting the whole culture and put it on, say, orcs or goblins or Ferengi or other aliens. On the other hand, I want to know if there's what kind of advice do you have for approach to, you know, design the culture based on the species and the creatures you are dealing with?
The question is, how would you design a new culture for a different species? For a non-human species, yeah.
Well, you know, that is always a challenge, especially in science fiction. It's like, we're human, that's really all we know. How do we create something that's so alien that I believe if, you know, any alien that we encounter, it may be so alien we don't even recognize it. So it's, I think by default, any engaging species to read about is going to have something that we as human readers can hang our hats on, because otherwise it'll probably just be so much gibberish that we're like, what is this? And it may be incredibly imaginative and inventive and a lot of work to construct, but if it's not connecting with your reader, then you're failing. So when I try to do that, I try to think of, again, you know, what did the environment shape this creature? How can I make it different and yet relatable? So you can kind of go out there and try and explore and play with a few things, but I think in the end you have to have something that we care about to connect to, and that is definitely always a challenge when you're trying to do that.
I think to add to that, I think it always amuses me when people say there can't be life on this planet because it doesn't have any of the 3 things that is needed for life. But those are the 3 things we need for life. You know, aliens could be completely different and weird, but the point is that we don't know. So I think as creators of fiction, we have to base our aliens on something we do know. So I think the best aliens are, for example, in the film District 9, I don't know what that's called in Poland, is it District 9? Great film, and it's basically a reflection of racism in South Africa. So we know where the aliens are coming from, we know their problems. So I think basically you have to base your aliens in the real world, although that is slightly annoying.
I think it depends on how accessible you want the aliens to be to the reader. If you want them to be, you know, 1,000% alien and very unrecognizable to the characters, and that's part of the plot, you can do that. When you look at like Star Trek and all the different species, they're all kind of vaguely humanoid and kind of have human qualities, and so it's kind of easy to connect with them as the readers and weave them into stories and things like that. If anyone's seen the movie or read the story, it was based off of Arrival. The way they deal with alien life is really interesting, and I feel like, you know, the writer, who was that? Was that, I want to say, Ted Chiang? So, like, I feel like very clearly much smarter than me, because, you know, the way that they interweave linguistics and mathematics to create like a communication bridge between humanity and the aliens, like, that's so fascinating. And so part of the other that these aliens are presenting to humanity is part of the story, and, you know, how he approaches everything, and it's so well done.
I was going to say no comment, but what I will say is that I nearly always try to show both points of view, and so it's very common in war for one side to regard the other side as alien or barbaric or inhuman, because that helps you go and kill them. And so one of the things that I try to do is to humanize the enemy, and I do that so by portraying characters on both sides of a war, and eventually what they'll come to realize, hopefully, that they're fighting and they'll keep fighting, but that the others are not aliens, they're the same as themselves. So thank you for the question. Any more questions?
Okay.
Hi. I would like to ask, what is the main difference, the key point, only one, when you are writing a novel, a short novel, or you are going to write a trilogy? So what is the most important difference between the two things? From all four of you, I'm curious.
Is the publisher going to pay me for 3 books or 1? Sorry.
But I mean, a trilogy takes 3-4 years to write, and I've just done 2 trilogies. I'm not going to do another one immediately. I think it's nice to have a break, and then I'll do some more. But
That pretty much sums it up right there.
When the publisher, I was being funny, but it's also serious, because when the publisher is paying your mortgage and paying for your kids' food, I've got young kids, I will do what I want to write. What I always write, what I like to write, but I will write as many as the publisher wants, usually, because it pays for my life. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. The approach, usually for me, I'd be different to Angus. I would want to write at least 2 or 3 or 4, because the story is usually bigger than 1 book. And so I can have some ideas for 1, but nearly always it's more than 1.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. So is there anyone who would like to ask it? Okay, I can see.
So when you come up with a book, like, if you want to write a book, do you first come up with the world, various aspects of it, and then you put in characters? Or do you just put in start with character and then build the world around him and what he's doing?
do you build the world first or the characters first?
Yes.
Well, for me, it always starts with the characters. They show up, and bit by bit, they kind of reveal their story to me and what their concerns are and who they are. Generally, my entry into a story is from the character first.
Stephen King builds the character first and then puts them in an extraordinary situation, and that's why his books are good. They're normal people in extraordinary situations. That's what I guess we all try and do to a degree. Personally, I build the world first, and then populate it. So I think it's up to you. And characters come, you know, new characters happen all the time. I think it's very important to remember that every single character should be a character. It should be a real person. They can't just be a foil for your heroes.
Yeah, I try to do them both at the same time. Usually it'll start with like the seed of an idea, whether it's a character that I like. If I read about an interesting person from history, or if I read a cool character that I say, oh, I'd like to do something similar, or maybe it could be a setting that I think up a setting and say, yeah, that's cool. What kind of people would live in it? But it starts with the seed of an idea, and then I kind of build everything up together. You know, I ask questions very rapidly. You know, if this is a character I'm interested in creating, what kind of world do they exist in? Because you have to build them at the same time, because that character is going to be a reflection of their world in some way, and the world is going to be, you know, have shaped that character.
Yeah, I like what you just said. I have to confess that my first few books, I mentioned the info dumps. I was so excited at the idea of writing books set in ancient Rome. Someone was paying me to write books about ancient Rome, that I just really, really, really wanted it to be a really amazing world, and everyone should know everything about it. And then the characters came in second, and I still want people to think that, but more and more now I think about the character, because character is what you as a reader like, and so I actually find myself thinking far more about my characters before I write a book, and what do I want them to be. But it's a mix. It's because it's got to have a great world around it as well. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for your answers for the panel. Thank you very much for listening. So let's end. So, thank you.